Only in recent times have Italian historians given attention to the mobilization of women during the First World War. I think of historians such as Curli, Bortoloni, Soldani, Pisa, Molinari, and many others. And their studies have at least cast light on the wide and complex changes that took place at that time in Italian women's lives. For many of them, the war led to new experiences beyond the confines of their usual role. Women of the working classes were employed in typically male jobs, while middle and upper classes women organized aid agencies in favor of the soldiers and their families and promoted nationalist propaganda campaigns. About 10,000 of them served as war nurses. During the war, the Red Cross voluntary nurses experienced a degree of independence quite unusual for bourgeois women. They traveled and lived amongst men to care uninhibitedly of the bodies of wounded or sick men. The leaders of the Red Cross women assumed authority and responsibility in military situations. They were given public recognition, medals, and awards. When the war began, Italian women were deeply committed to the struggle for their rights. In 1908, the first conference of Italian women took place in Rome. Hundreds of women of various social conditions attended it. Their common purpose was the achievement of political rights, equality before the law, rights for women workers, access to higher education and the professions. The colonial war of 1911 and the Italian occupation of Libya caused a split in the feminist alliance of 1908. While many bourgeois and aristocratic women applauded Italian expansionism, socialist women in the spirit of socialist and feminist internationalism were almost univocal in condemning militarism in the pages of journals such as La Pace or La Difesa delle Lavoratrici. In 1914, after the outbreak of war, while the Italian government at first adhered to a policy of neutrality, a more serious rift occurred in the feminist alliance. It was related both to class and to individual political choices. Some women, mainly bourgeois or aristocratic, organized associations and founded journals calling for the Italian intervention. The socialists remained largely pacifist, but some of them broke ranks, parting from their companions in order to advocate Italian intervention against Austria and Germany. Historians have pointed both to the broad public consensus in favor of the war, I think, for instance, at Audouin Rousseau Becker, as well as to the various forms of disagreement in the Italian case, for instance, Antonio Gibelli. The wartime, as later in Italy the fascist period, were of course far from being the best condition to foster disagreement with the war. Indeed, archives and libraries show us at a first glance mostly the wide mass agreement, women included, in favor of the war. Feminists converted into nationalists, intellectuals who volunteered as Red Cross nurses, all seem at the first sight unanimous in asserting their duty of supporting the holy war against the predatory Austro-Germans. They all thought of the war as a sacrifice, producing the regeneration of the fatherland. As well as most socialist women, also a small minority of school teachers disagreed with nationalist values and refused to transmit the war rhetoric to their pupils, but they often paid a high price for this dissent. Disciplinary procedures, prison, and even internal exile. Italian Red Cross nurses, volunteers in war hospitals, among all mobilized women, were the ones who, together with women from religious orders specializing as nurses, had the closest contact with the physical and moral ravages that the war inflicted on a whole generation of young men. The author of this paper has analyzed some of their memoirs stored in the National Library in Naples in the sprawling Fondo Aosta collection. Most memoirs are from letters or journals having been revised by the original authors for the publication. Most nurses belonged to the upper classes and to families sharing deep patriotic feelings rooted in the memory of fathers and grandfathers who had volunteered in the war of the Risorgimento. The only memoir of a working-class nurse in the collection I have examined is from Luisa Zeni, future icon of the fascist action squads. Like her bourgeois and aristocratic colleagues, she was a fervent nationalist, and her family had a patriotic and irredentist tradition. The patriotism of the Red Cross nurses is steeped in the ideology of the Risorgimento. The war was seen as a continuation of the wars of independence in order to annex Trento and Trieste and to give redemption, as they said, to the Italians living there. As bourgeois women, they had all been inculcated with a model of femininity based on devotion to family, caring aptitudes, altruism, piety, philanthropy, to which they were expected to conform. I wondered how they could reconcile the values of their upbringing with the horror of the war. After all, I suppose, too, that female writings at that time might be considered with more indulgence when at variance with public and nationalist rhetoric, thanks to gender stereotypes that supposed women to be more sentimental and emotional than men, and in any case irrelevant in the political field. I wonder if men could have written with the same realism during the war on immediately after the war, when Frescura, for instance, Attilio Frescura writes in 1919 about self-inflicted mutilations and other soldiers' behaviors well different from the official image of the soldier. He is hardly criticized, accused, not the nurses I studied. Besides irredentist objectives, the war nurses shared the notion of sacrifice, a purifying sacrifice aimed at regenerating the fatherland, analogous to Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. Having such a mystical perception of the war as a point of departure, war nurses could sometimes be critical and ironic towards the men who saw the war as the perfect scene in which to display fearless bravery. Most Red Cross nurses represent themselves through the reassuring familiar images of mothers and sisters of the soldiers. The metaphor is able to legitimate the presence of women in the scene of the war. Nevertheless, the advent of the war nurse was a break with the traditional bourgeois woman's role in terms of dynamism and independence. But it was not an unbridled emancipation. To reassure conventional society, strict discipline was imposed on them, and their compulsory uniforms were similar to the habits of the nuns who were traditionally present in the male hospitals. Nevertheless, the traditional relationship between the sexes and the protagonist role of the soldier were overturned in war hospitals. Wounded and sick, weak and dependent on their nurses' cares, men slid back to the condition of children. Nurses became accustomed to referring to them as my children, my big children. It was they that now patronized the soldiers, giving them small gifts, taking care of their correspondence with their families, teaching illiterate soldiers to read and write. The soldiers, on the other hand, expressed devoted and grateful feelings. Since most of the soldiers were of a lower social condition than their nurses, the nurses were all the more able to adopt patronizing attitudes. Although the war nurses generally share the same background of attitudes, feelings, and ideals, their memoirs reveal significant differences amongst them according to their individual personalities. The Journal of the Inspector General of the Voluntary Nurses of the CRI, Duchess Helena d'Aosta, for instance, reveals a pragmatic and almost managerial style, testifying an unceasing commitment to the efficiency of military medical services. Little space is left to the expression of her personal feelings and thoughts. Most memoirs, nevertheless, show the tension between horror and repugnance towards the war, on the one hand, and the patriotic ideals of duty and sacrifice on the other. They reveal innermost feelings that are painful and contradictory. Perhaps even more significant than this is the fact that they give us a realistic description of their war experience outside the sphere of public rhetoric, hypocrisy, and censorship. Most memoirs report the most brutal aspects of the war in no less details than the most realistic of male memoirs or Otto Dix's prints. Disgusting smells, wrecked faces and bodies, rats running in the nurses' dormitories are described realistically, without the slightest trace of the sweetened and romantic images of the war that were commonplace in the illustrated magazines of the time. Women used to live in the comfort of their bourgeois homes, adapted to life in the dirt and in continuous contact with death, no less than the soldiers in the trenches. Sita Meyer-Camperio writes, "We have become almost indifferent to germs, lice, mice. The smell of the gangrene is terrible," Maria Luisa Perduca writes. "It reminds you of the smell of stagnant pond water where the remains of dead grass snakes and animals float." The memoir report facts that were rigorously censored by the war press. Delirious and suicidal soldiers, the hideous sarcastic laughing as of a skull of soldiers who had gone mad. The nurses had no false optimism concerning the destiny of the disabled soldiers, the shock of the families facing a loved one who is no more himself but a poor, wrecked body, or the hopelessly wounded who beg in vain to be killed. Many nurses fell ill. Some died of epidemics, exhaustion, or bombings. They were 44, according with Stefania Bartoloni. Many of the ill nurses, after a short leave to recover their health, returned to their posts. Having witnessed the true face of the war, some nurses expressed their rejection of the nationalist rhetoric. Rizzoli, for instance, criticizes the abstract ideologies of her own community, the bourgeois intellectual elite that had become delirious on sublime abstract ideas. Besides the notion of sacrifice, this memoir clearly expressed the perception of war as an opportunity for emancipation. For these ladies of the upper classes accustomed to the vanity of their salons, hospital life, hard as it was, offered the means to discover their own strength. It gave them the opportunity to have friendship, solidarity, and close relationship with the soldiers. Camperio writes that nurses come to have much more love for their cabin in the hospital train or their hospital room with only a nail on which to hang their cloak than the worldly life and the luxury furniture of their homes. And she wonders if it would be possible to them to become once more the frivolous ladies they had been. Southern women, too, seem able to free themselves from the stereotype of their backwardness, as proudly notices Delia Iannelli, a nurse from Taranto. She says that even Southern women leave their homes, work in the fields, in the offices, among the wounded. Though the war produced new autonomy and self-confidence in the Red Cross women, it was often damned and detested. The nurses dare not raise open doubts about the high moral value of the war. Complying with the public discourse on the war, they condemns as subversive and defeatist any appeal to peace, unless it openly referred to peace as the result of victory. Nurses constantly underline that this is the only kind of peace they desire. Let's hope that peace will come, but a victorious peace. Fits of discouragement, even doubts on the meaning of the war, are constantly resolved by the mystical notion of sacrifice and national regeneration, a religion of patriotism justifiable only by faith, not by reason. As Perduca writes in June 1915, the name of Italy wells up from my heart, pure and spontaneous, as a prayer, and so many others similar. Nevertheless, some nurses arrive at a point when they finally express their piercing doubts on the meaning of the war. It is the case in particular of Maria Luisa Perduca and Elisa Meyer Rizzioli. The latter was a co-founder of the Red Cross Voluntary Nurses and had participated in the Italo-Turkish War. Perduca, in February 1916, writes, "I am exhausted, and I curse the war, curse the destiny, curse the men who wanted the war, who prepared it, caused it. No more blood, no more pus, no more screams, no more death, no more tears. Our young age revolts, desperately revolts. Our souls, if they had turned to stone, has become brutish with anguish in the past days, awake in ourselves and burst into blind violence against everything and everyone. Then an endless desire to run away, to die, assails us, not to see anymore, not to hear anymore, and not to hate anymore our enemies, who perhaps are merely the victims of the same dark fate. Even hate against the inhuman enemy, a pillar of the nationalist rhetoric, gives space to doubt. Like the other nurses, Perduca never questions her duty toward the soldiers. The crux of the matter is the meaning of the war itself. Even if she searches for answers in the ideology that motivated her choice, day by day, her patriotic mysticism drifts toward a more and more irrational and obscure attitude, and in November 1916, she left the hospitals not to return. In the letter written by Elisa Meyer Rizzioli, too, the stirring enthusiasm of interventionist demonstrations, after a few weeks of experience of the real war, gives way to the unsolved contradiction between her sense of patriotic duty and the horror of war. Painful doubts on the meaning of the war give way every time to acts of faith in the holy crusade against the brutish enemy. A few months after the beginning of the war, overwhelmed by visions of horror and mutilations, she writes, "I take shelter in my cabin as a wild cat or a lost creature. My soul gropes in the dark. I have nothing more to cling on to. Heroism, glory, country, wars empty of meaning. Big copper coins that make much noise but are worthless." Unlike Maria Luisa Perduca, Elisa Meyer Rizzioli performs her duty as a nurse throughout the whole war, save for short periods of illness, but her feelings drift from the enthusiasm of the first days to a painful uncertainty. In the end, victory for her is no longer a sufficient purpose, as it will not put an end to hatred between nations. Indeed, she longs for a spiritual intervention, that a prophet will come to regenerate suffering mankind. What historical meaning, and she comes back home, she writes like a woman who has lost herself, who dares no hope in life and love. What historical meaning can we give to the doubts that these upper-class ladies came to experience when they came into contact with the real war, shaking their faith in the religious value of the war? Are they simply spontaneous and transitory individual feelings, or can we think of them as symptoms of the decline of that religion of the patriotic war that Italians had inherited from the Risorgimento, later to be resuscitated by fascist rhetoric? There is no doubt that in Italy, the beginning of the Second World War was not welcomed by spontaneous mass demonstrations of enthusiasm as the Great War had been. And after 1945, the rhetoric of the Holy and Patriotic War was totally replaced by the new public rhetoric on the value of peace and European integration. Perhaps the flickering changes in the consciousness of the volunteer nurses in the Great War may be seen as part of this development. Thank you.